Welcome to Lyric Lab Poetry. My name is Martin Jago. I thought in this video it might be really interesting for us to look at, to explore a poem together. Of course, when we read poetry, we do it for a variety of reasons, but often it's for the sensory landscape of a poem, the way it makes us feel, the sound shapes, the energy of the poem, the ideas that are being explored, the surprise of the ending, and just all the pleasure we take from poetry in general terms. However, there's another pleasure to be had, to be squeezed out of a poem, and that is to look under the hood and see how a good poem does what it does successfully, and see if we can understand and relate to that and analyze it, and ultimately see if we can learn anything from that. So I have a poem in mind. Whether you're familiar with it or not is not really important. However, I'm just going to link to that right now on my laptop with a click of a button so you can see it. So here it is. It's called Snow by Louis MacNeice, and it's a very famous poem, but that, as I said, is not really important. The exercise, if you're up for the challenge, is to just go to the link in the description below the video where you'll find that poem. You can then cut and paste it into a document, print it off, so you have your very own printout like this one here that I've already been scribbling notes on. And we're going to do an exercise together, side by side, concurrently. And it's just a really useful way to explore and to flex your own powers of critical thinking. So if you're up for the challenge, pause the video, go and print off the poem, and when you're ready, we'll get started. So the first thing to ask you to do is just take a look at the poem on the page and just write down a few ideas or responses to what you're actually looking at. Imagine that we're looking at the landscape of the poem from very, very far away. So we're not really reading the poem at the minute, we're just reading its shape, we're reading the landscape. And then just write 2 or 3 very key observations about what it looks like on the page, and anything that maybe sticks out, whether for a good reason or bad reason, anything that you might see as you cast your eye over the landscape of the poem, anything happening internally or at the ends of lines that sticks out, just very simple sort of landscape observations. And I'm going to do the same thing right now. So let's do it. Okay, so just to share a couple of observations, ones that you may have made as well. First of all, I can see the poem. It looks quite formal on the page. There are 3 stanzas of 4 lines each, so 3 quatrains. And I notice also that the letters of each line are capitalized, which is also a sort of more formal approach to the writing of the poem. And when I think about that 3-part structure, I'm thinking about obviously a beginning, a middle, and an end. I'm thinking about the introduction of ideas, the development, and then the resolution, or thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. That's what I'm seeing when I observe the sort of shape of the poem on the page. So it appears to be sort of, formal-ish. I did notice some very long lines. The first line of the first stanza does appear to be quite long, unusually long in that stanza. And I have to tell you, if this was a poem that was brought into a poetry workshop that I was facilitating, I would mention that to the poet. Not to, say there's anything wrong with that overly long line, but just to draw their attention to it, to let them know it sticks out. Is that something they were aware of? Is that the idea? And if not, is there another place where a line break in that first line might work? Then of course you would have to relineate the whole poem. And anyway, now I'm actually reading the first line. I can see the kind of suspense that the end of the line creates. There's a great bay window, and that part of the line says, the great bay window was. So there's a tension there before we get down to the next line. Other observations about the poem and its landscape? Anything else that you saw that I've not mentioned? I noticed actually that the punctuation is very sparse. It really is. In fact, there are lines here that if those lines appeared in a piece of prose writing, we would expect a lot more commas. There are also a few M dashes I noticed because I'm a fan of M dashes. I use them a lot in my own writing, so I noticed those in the last stanza. I also noticed, and I might be wrong about this. Am I wrong? No, I'm not. there's only one point of punctuation internally, and that is there is a point of punctuation here after the word plural, right in the middle of that second stanza. So it strikes me before I even get to read the poem that there's a kind of velocity here that the poet is aiming for. So I think the next thing is just to grab my laptop. So again, we can bring up that poem on the laptop, and you can see it at the same time as me. So here we go. And I can just read the poem out loud. And I'm reading out loud because the next part of the exercise is to just listen to the sound shape and the soundscape of the poem, and to circle or underline anything that sticks out, any sounds that kind of strike us as unusual or surprising. Also, if there are any words in there or any words that come together that have a particular kind of rhythmic quality to them or a nice cadence, something you enjoy the sound of, circle those as well. And also, finally, any words or any parts of the poem that you don't really understand the meaning of those words, underline or circle those as well. Snow by Louis MacNeice. The room was suddenly rich, and the great bay window was spawning snow and pink roses against it, soundlessly collateral and incompatible. World is suddener than we fancy it. World is crazier and more of it than we think, incorrigibly plural. I peel and portion a tangerine and spit the pips and feel the drunkenness of things being various. And the fire flames with a bubbling sound, for world is more spiteful and gay than one supposes. On the tongue, on the eyes, on the ears, in the palms of one's hands, there is more than glass between the snow and the huge roses. I mentioned that first line earlier, and I actually really like the first line and the kind of dangling that was at the end of the line that creates the tension, and the reader wants to know what the great bay window is doing. And then we get the surprise of a great bay window spawning something, which is very odd. So I've circled the word spawning. How can a window spawn snow? Well, I think of spawning, of course, as sort of reproductive, so in other words, maybe the snow falling against the window and the flakes sticking and multiplying, but also like small eggs. It's an idea I'd never thought of before reading this poem. I would never describe snow falling against the window like a spawning, but that's what makes the poem really work, I think. It's a really surprising and arresting kind of image. Next, I have on line 3, you can see here, soundlessly collateral and incompatible. World is suddener than we fancy it. Soundlessly collateral. So we've got the snow falling against the window, and then we've got the pink roses, I presume, in a vase on a table near the window. But how are these two things soundlessly collateral? And this is the point at which if it's not clear to you, go and look at the word collateral and see if there are other meanings to the word. When I think of the word collateral, I don't think about it in this context. I think of the word as either a security that is put forward or offered against a loan. So John put his house up as, his house was collateral on the loan, on the money he borrowed from the bank. We have also heard the expression collateral damage. This is a very cynical use of language, isn't it? Because we often hear that framed within a war or within, the context of dropping bombs on people. And for someone to explain, a 5-star general to explain, oh yeah, there was some collateral damage. We mean sort of secondary damage, not the main target, but maybe damage caused, a kind of overspill of damage into other areas. So those are the two main contexts I would think about when I think about this word, but I do know that there is another meaning to the word collateral, and that is that it means kind of side by side with or parallel to. And I think that's the meaning that is being used here. So if you think about that in the context of the poem, You have the snow falling outside, you have the pink roses inside the room, and these things together, they don't make any noise. They are soundlessly collateral and incompatible. So they are soundlessly side by side. The roses are not making a noise, the snow is not making a noise, and yet they are kind of making a metaphorical noise because the speaker is observing these things and thinking how they are sort of just there together and also incompatible. I think they are incompatible because we associate roses with a different season. You know, we're not expecting roses in the garden in the winter. So these things are in a way incompatible. And then the speaker switches to talk about the kind of surprise of these things together. World is suddener. It's an odd kind of turn of phrase there. The world is suddener than we fancy it. So I think what the speaker is saying here is that sometimes, you know, these things just happen and we happen upon them and suddenly realize how strange these things are. World is crazier and more of it than we think. More of it than we think. And we come to this phrase, tricky phrase on line 2 of the second stanza. I'm not sure if you had that circled. I have it underlined here. Incorrigibly plural. So something that can't be corrected or undone. And what is that thing? I think it's a sort of irreducible manyness. Plurality is what the poet's really talking about here. So, you know, I peel and portion a tangerine and spit the pips. There's also something else. I want you just to pause the video again and just write on your poem here anything that sort of you observe about the way the language is working in two distinct camps. The words, the important words. I'm not talking about the pronouns or the prepositions, but the main language in the poem seems to me to fall into two kind of groups of words. For me, at least, it seems that the words in the poems are either sort of cerebral, sort of abstract ideas expressed in a sort of Latinate-rooted kind of intellect-based language. So when we hear phrases like incorrigibly plural or soundlessly collateral, they sound very cerebral ways of describing things, abstract ways. But then when we talk about spitting the pips and the feel of something, and then later we get to the fire and the flames bubbling, we get to a very sort of sensory way of describing things. So maybe head words and heart words is a way to think about those things. The last line of stanza 2 I have underlined as well. This is also a very famous line from the poem. It's as if the speaker is kind of just overcome in that moment with all of these. Isn't it strange sometimes to be, you know, part of the human experience and to feel the things you feel, the things that you taste, the things that you smell, the things that you even sense in a sort of subconscious way that you're not really paying attention to, like the sensation of the fabric against your skin, the little scratch I got up here in the corner of my nose and at the back of my head. And, you know, all of those things together, and the colors and just the kind of sensory overload where was your brain to sort of be able to almost take it all in at the same time. The speaker continues in a sort of resolution of the poem, stanza 3. I noticed the bubbling sound, the fire flaming, that sensory language that I mentioned. But here's also something that strikes me as a little unusual, that the world is more spiteful and gay than one supposes. And it's more spiteful and gay on the tongue, on the eyes, on the ears, and the palms of one's hands. Now that line is not punctuated at all, and that's because poetry can do that. I think because the poet is, and it's quite a long line. In fact, it's the longest line in the poem, longer than the first line. So I think in order to kind of create that kind of sensory feeling of everything arriving at the same time, he has removed the punctuation, and you know, those sensations are kind of overlapping with one another. And he's done that by taking out grammar that we might expect to see there were this a line of prose. So that's one observation. And then more spiteful and gay. I think again, this relates to our human experience, doesn't it? of, sometimes the world is cruel. Well, the world is not actually cruel or happy, it just is. And our interpretation of our fortunes are shaped around that. It may be that the farmer is waiting for rain, and the fact that it doesn't appear may seem cruel. Someone at the beach is lying underneath that same sun and enjoying it, taking pleasure for it, then their experience is wholly different. So that's interesting to me, that he's expressed that in a very human way. And then we get to the last line of the poem. There is more than glass between the snow and the huge roses, which we will come back to in a moment, because I want you to pause the video again now and just read through the poem one more time, taking your time by yourself, and then put the poem down and just explain out loud what happens in the poem. Forget the big ideas of the poem, but were you to explain to a friend what actually happens in the poem, what would you say? I would do the same exercise. If I was explaining to a friend this poem, I would say, well, it's about this person. The speaker of the poem is in a room. There's a big bay window, so I'm imagining it's a lounge. It feels quite comfortable. There are some flowers, maybe in a vase, and they are near the window. It's a big bay window, and snow is falling outside, so we can presume we are at least in the place where there are 4 seasons. It's the winter, and this speaker is kind of nestled in the poem. There's a fireplace, and the fire is kind of crackling and bubbling, and the speaker takes a tangerine and peels it and eats it and spits the pips into the fire, and it is suddenly aware of the kind of strangeness of that human experience, which doesn't seem particularly out of the ordinary, doesn't seem particularly unusual. But for the speaker of the poem, it really is that sort of sudden realization of all these things kind of colluding at the same time. That's how I would explain the poem and what's happening inside the poem. The next thing we want to do is to return to the sort of the main ideas of the poem. And again, you should pause the video and just write down what you think the poem is trying to say. So you've just explained what's happening in the poem to your friend, and then they turn around and say, yeah, but what's it really about? That's the next thing I would like you to articulate on the page. So again, take your paper and just scribble down some of the main ideas. And for me, when I reflect, and assuming you've done that part of the exercise, when I think about the poem, I think it's absolutely about that sort of mystery of the human experience and how wonderfully various it can be. I think it was Isaiah Berlin, the British philosopher, who said that there is no libretto to life. There is no incorrigible proposition. In other words, no master text, whether it's a Bible, whether it's a religious book, whether it's a political book, whether it's Das Kapital. No one book will give you all the answers, because the plurality of existence is so various that it could overwhelm you to think about how all these things are separate, but they're all connected. There's a deeper sort of plurality. And the wonderful thing about the poem for me is that the poem attempts to capture that. And it's a kind of, I always feel it's kind of tinged with sadness that it's a bold and noble thing that the poet does in trying to give expression to the human experience. How can these ciphers, black ink on a white background, how can those things possibly reach or touch even the shadow of the foot of the thing we're trying to get to? And that is what it means to be human. But I have to say, I think this poem does a really excellent job of getting there. Maybe, obviously it can never arrive, but certainly some poems make us feel very much that we are capturing an essence or a flavor of that thing it means to be human. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this exploration. Louis MacNeice is a wonderful poet, if you don't know Louis MacNeice. Oh, a couple of other things that just popped into my head. First of all, this poem, I think, was written in the 1930s, about 1935, I believe. So it feels like a very modern poem to me. If I didn't know Louis MacNeice was one of the Auden group in the 1930s at Oxford, then I would think this was a perfectly sort of modern poem. And the other thing I wanted to say is when we were talking about things that stuck out, sound shapes, I love the sudden alliterative quality of plural and peeling and portioning and spitting the pips. That P sound that really sticks out there in the second stanza. I think it's a wonderful poem. That's part of the reason I've shared it today. But also the main focus has been on analyzing and reflecting and digging down into the poem and seeing what we can discover, seeing how the poet does what they do so successfully. So thank you very much for watching. And of course, as always, if you've enjoyed the video, please do give it a thumbs up and click on the subscribe button if you haven't yet done that. And of course, I will be back very soon with more poetry content. Thanks for watching.